All right, today we're going to do the second lesson in this portion of the unit called Libraries Investigate. So we're going to move into Code Studio a little bit, but first let's just do quick discussion question. We're going to learn how to use libraries and share code with one another. Usually you do this by writing functions with parameters and return values. So not just a function, but a function with parameters and that returns a value. Why do you think it's important to use parameters and return values when writing code for other people to use? So hopefully you came up with that. It does allow for a lot more flexibility within anyone's program. So if you say that this square can be created based on height, width, color, then even if you intended it to be used a certain way, now someone else can use that. An end user, we call them, can use your code to create a completely different type of square. And anybody in the world can use that function and they can just plug in the different parameters that they care about or the different arguments into the parameters that they care about. And it just makes it more flexible for everybody involved. Now, we're going to do an activity today, and we have an activity guide that I have posted for you on Google Classroom. So you need to have that open. It's just going to walk you through bubbles 2 and 3 of Code Studio. And as part of the instructions, it's going to ask you questions, right, on Code Studio. There are questions involved sometimes that we will discuss in class, but I want you to answer those questions on your activity guide. So go ahead and navigate to level 2 on Code Studio, which is linked on Google Classroom and also linked on your activity guide. And you're going to run the app trying several different inputs. So play around with it, test it out. If you don't understand exactly how something's working, watch the code or read through the code and try to figure it out. Then you're going to discuss what happens when a button is clicked. When that button is clicked, I guess specifically. So that button typically is going to update the screen, run several different functions in order to do so. And those functions are being called from a library, which is going to return the text and images that is displayed on the screen. So at this point, I would like you to go back to Google Classroom and watch another video that I have for you called, now I forgot what it's called. Something in App Lab. Oh, libraries in App Lab. That's what it's called. And I didn't make the video, but it's a great, just kind of a general tutorial walkthrough of everything that has to do with libraries and how to share your code with others and how to access other people's code in Code Studio. So you kind of know what's going on and you can move through the rest of this a little bit easier. Next, you're going to open the functions drawer. I've not used that term before, but that just means over here on Code Studio where it lists, um, UI elements and math and controls and whatever it says, and then functions. And that just means that you're going to open up all the items in the toolbox that have to do with functions. You're going to look at each of these state library functions, which are right here, and mouse over them for the documentation. So this should give you all that you need in order to answer the questions. You should not have to click on, there's like a C code link usually on there. So it's going to say, for example, this one, state library is the name of the library. State abbreviation is the name of the function. State name is the parameter that you can input in order to run this function. It's going to give the abbreviation for a particular state. So state name is going to be a string, which is the name of the state. String just means it's in quotes, right? So when someone were to call this function, they would put an actual name of a state inside the parameters parentheses. It's going to return also a string, which is the two-letter state abbreviation if the state exists. Otherwise, it will return not found. So possibly this would be involved in an if statement. What you are going to do is list how you think each of these functions work just by mousing over it and looking over the documentation. And so give it a very simple explanation. You don't need to be too technical. Next, you are going to click Manage Libraries. So you click on the little gear, click Manage Libraries, and then you're going to view the code for the state library. And then you're going to read through the library, discuss how the functions work. You're going to answer that on your activity guide. And then you're going to answer if you were accurate in your predictions. Once you tested it out, once you looked at the code, were you correct in how it worked? So what do you think the benefits are of hiding all the code for filtering the data set in a library? Hopefully, you can realize that it makes the project code really neat and organized. We don't have just tons of code in our program, but we can just simply call a function with one line and do something with it without having the rest of the code cluttering up our program. So the end user doesn't need to know all the inner workings of that function. They don't need to know what all is in it. They just need to know the documentation. They need to know how it works, what it's supposed to do, what you're supposed to input as far as parameters, and what it should output in a return. But what information do they need to know in order to use those library functions? They're going to need to know all the things I just mentioned. And how can we make sure that they do know those things? Probably with comments, some great comments. So we got to give it good documentation and good comments so that the end user is going to be able to use our function and know that it's going to work correctly. So now we're moving to level 2. You're going to run the app and try some different inputs. And you're going to open the functions drawer again, look at each of the strings library functions, mouse over them for the documentation, and describe how each of them work just by looking at the documentation. Then you're going to test the functions. So reread the documentation for each one as you put in a console log statement at the end of the program, call the function, and then give it a reasonable argument for the parameter. Here's an example. If I want a console log, as soon as I write console log, then I'm going to write the name of the function that I want to call. So here is the whole one. You should be able to drag that over in Code Studio. And then here's what you're going to put as your argument that is going to be processed through that parameter. And then hit run to see the output. And then do that with all the rest of the functions. You want a console log statement for each of those. I believe there was 4 functions. And then you're going to list on your activity guide, is the output what you expected? And try several different inputs. So why should we test the functions in the library? What does this help us to know? Well, it's a good idea to test it to make sure that it really does work the way we were intending it to work. It helps us to know whether this is something that is actually going to help us in our program, if it's going to return the value that we need it to return. It also will let us know if there's any errors in the code. Maybe we need to reread the documentation. Maybe we were unclear on what it actually does. Or maybe we need to contact whoever created the code and tell them if there is an actual error. Now you're going to go back to the States app, so that bubble 2, and add console log statements there for each of the functions, test them out, and make sure that the output is as expected. And you're going to answer those questions on your activity guide as well. So what makes a good library function? How can you make sure that the end users of your library have what they need in order to use your functions? So one thing that it should include are parameters so that they can plug in what they need to plug in and the function will function correctly. Also, they're going to need some great comments. They're going to need some great documentation so that they can understand what the function is intended to do, what the inputs and outputs are, and just, in general, kind of clarify what's going on. You may have come up with some more things. Let me see. Everything it needs. Variables. Global variables should not be in a function. Global variables or references to element IDs that the end user may not have. So if you reference, you're going to get text from input box 1. You don't want that in your function because now another user is not going to have something called input box 1. Or if you're calling a variable that was created outside of the function, that would make it a global variable, meaning any of your functions can use it. Then the end user is not going to have that global variable, and that's going to cause problems for them. So you'll need to clean that up if you are intending to share your code. So let's review algorithms. Once you've answered all the questions on your activity guide, we're going to talk just a little bit about algorithms, and this will help you answer the closing questions for today. So up to this point, most of the algorithms you've used, you created yourself, or you modified existing code. Those were any kind of list of steps that you did. Your program is an algorithm because it follows certain steps. A function is an algorithm, it follows certain steps. So look at the functions in level 2 and 3 that call library functions. Notice that we can build new functions by combining the existing library functions. Essentially, we're creating new algorithms by using existing algorithms. We're taking these steps and we're taking these steps, and now we're kind of mixing them up to create our own algorithm. So why is that a good thing? What's the benefit of using existing algorithms? So some existing algorithms you may have seen, maximum or minimum of 2 or more numbers, some kind of mathematical equation that's helping you to figure that out. The sum or average of 2 or more numbers. An algorithm that determines if an integer can be evenly divided by another integer. That was our mod operator. Or a robot's path through a maze. Those are some algorithms that you have seen. This is, let me see. Oh, yes, this is something that we call procedural abstraction. So, abstraction in general is talking about I can use this. I don't need to know how it works under the surface. I just need to know how to use it. Something like using a TV remote to operate your TV. You don't need to know how the TV works. You don't need to know how it gets its information from Netflix or any of those things. All you need to know is how to use the remote. So procedural abstraction is essentially that concept, but specifically with code. So we're talking about we have a process, and we don't need to know how the process works. We just need to know how to call the process. So a function, someone else's function, especially, we don't need to know all the code that's inside that function. We just need to know what it does and how to use it. So that's how our libraries work. There is also a term for using libraries or other forms of organization in a program, and that is modularity. And that just means that instead of having one long program with tons and tons of lines of code, we're subdividing it into little subprograms, which are our functions, or even a library function, somebody else's function that we're just inserting. So we're really cleaning up and organizing our code through something called modularity. Some takeaways, and these are also at the bottom of your activity guide. And you're just going to look through those and highlight and write down any questions that you still have about libraries. So the process of creating a library, you're going to first build a function, you're going to add documentation, and then you're going to share it as a library. Using a library, click Manage Libraries, either choose a classmate's library or paste in a library code. Then you're going to call those functions by writing the library name, dot, name of the function, and then any arguments that go in the parameters. Testing a library, you're going to use console log as the end user to test functions in a library. Check that the output is what you expect. Read the library code if something does not work correctly, and contact the library owner if something needs to be changed. So to wrap up, think about reasons why someone would argue for the following 3 statements. Libraries help programmers collaborate because libraries help programmers reuse code because libraries help programmers write simpler programs because. So all of those just have to do with saving us time and effort. We can now reuse the same thing that we've used or someone else has used. We don't need to reinvent the wheel every single time.